For hours, Flight 74E had been the epitome of routine. The hum of the engines, the gentle rocking of the fuselage, the muted murmur of conversations punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional baby's cry. The soundtrack of countless transatlantic journeys. Outside the oval windows, a vast expanse of navy blue sky stretched endlessly, the sun a distant, unwavering disk casting long shadows across the cabin. Inside, passengers settled into their routines. Some dozed, lulled by the monotonous drone of the aircraft. Others were engrossed in movies or books, escaping into other worlds thousands of feet above the Earth. Business travelers tapped away at laptops, deadlines and deals still hovering even at cruising altitude. Families navigated the cramped aisles, children restless despite the novelty of air travel. Flight attendants, practiced and efficient, moved with quiet purpose, attending to needs, offering drinks, ensuring a semblance of order in the contained world of the 747. Then, the script deviated. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A flicker of unease, a shift in the atmosphere like a sudden drop in cabin pressure felt not in the ears, but in the gut. It started with seat 32B. Thomas Ashton, a man in his late 50s, traveling back to London after a business trip to New York, slumped against the window. His head rested at an unnatural angle, his breathing shallow and erratic. Initially, it was dismissed as fatigue, perhaps a touch of air sickness. A flight attendant, noticing his stillness during a drink service, approached with a practiced smile and a polite inquiry. No response. A gentle shake of the shoulder yielded nothing. Concern began to replace routine. The flight attendant, a young woman named Clara, her smile now strained, called for assistance. Another crew member, a more seasoned steward named David, joined her, his expression instantly turning serious as he assessed the situation. They attempted to rouse Mr. Ashton, their voices hushed, their movements cautious, mindful of the other passengers. When they checked for a pulse, a palpable tension filled the small space around seat 32B. It was faint, thready, barely there. "Medical emergency," David announced, his voice low but urgent, already reaching for the intercom to alert the cockpit. The call went out for a doctor on board, the universal plea for help echoing through the cabin. But even as the initial flurry of activity focused on Mr. Ashton, a different kind of observer was already piecing together a different narrative. Air Marshal Isabella "Izzy" Diaz blended seamlessly into the passenger manifest. Dressed in unassuming civilian clothes, positioned strategically towards the rear of the plane, she was the silent guardian, the unseen layer of security designed to preempt threats before they materialized. Years of training had honed her senses, sharpened her instincts to a razor's edge. She saw what others missed, registered anomalies that would pass unnoticed by untrained eyes. While the cabin crew rushed to assist Mr. Ashton, Izzy's gaze remained fixed, not on the unfolding medical situation directly, but on the periphery, on the subtle details that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just the pallor of Mr. Ashton's skin, although that was striking, an almost waxy quality that felt distinct from mere illness. It was the stillness, yes, but more than that, it was the lack of struggle. Someone collapsing from a heart attack, a stroke, even a severe fainting spell would typically exhibit some involuntary movement, some sign of distress, a clenching of a fist, a gasp for air, a twitch. Mr. Ashton was simply inert, as if a switch had been flipped, turning him off. And then there was the almost unnatural stillness of his limbs, the way they seemed to settle into place as if posed, not relaxed. Izzy's gaze flickered around the cabin, a rapid, almost imperceptible scan. Her eyes landed on seat 11A, several rows forward, on the opposite side of the aisle. Another figure was slumped, head lolling to the side. At first glance, it mirrored the scene at 32B, but Izzy saw it instantly. The same unnatural pallor, the same eerie stillness, the same unsettling lack of any struggle. It was Ms. Eleanor Vance, a woman in her early 60s, returning home after visiting family in New York. Izzy had noted her earlier, a quiet, unassuming woman with a kind face reading a paperback novel. Now, she was motionless, mirroring the disturbing tableau at the back of the plane. A cold dread began to creep into Izzy's awareness, a chilling premonition that transcended protocol and training. Two passengers, separated by distance, exhibiting identical, profoundly disturbing symptoms, almost simultaneously. The odds of two unrelated, severe medical emergencies occurring in such close proximity on the same flight were astronomically low. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. This was something coordinated, something deliberate, something else. The initial call for a doctor had gone unanswered. Now, David, his voice tighter, made a second announcement, his tone betraying a growing unease that he struggled to mask. Passengers began to stir, their conversations dying down, sensing the shift in atmosphere, the subtle current of anxiety rippling through the cabin. Murmurs started, hushed whispers questioning what was happening. Fear, the silent, invisible passenger, began to board Flight 74E. Izzy moved with quiet precision. She unfastened her seatbelt, rising smoothly, her movements fluid and controlled despite the tightening knot of apprehension in her stomach. She moved towards the aisle, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the passengers, searching, assessing. Who were they? What were their stories? And more importantly, who among them was responsible for this unfolding nightmare? Her training kicked in, overriding the rising tide of fear. Assess, analyze, react. But this was unlike anything she had encountered in her years of service. This wasn't a bomb threat, a hijacking, a disruptive passenger. This was something insidious, something unseen, operating in the shadows of the ordinary, turning the mundane routine of air travel into a terrifying, high-altitude crime scene. And as she moved towards the front of the plane, towards the second silent figure in seat 11A, a chilling thought crystallized in her mind. If there were two victims already, how many more were there? And what or who would be next? The uneventful flight was over. The investigation had begun. 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, a deadly game was underway. Agent Diaz initiated a covert investigation within the pressurized confines of the aircraft. With limited resources and the need to maintain passenger calm, she began piecing together fragmented clues. The victims, seemingly unconnected, displayed no outward signs of struggle, yet their demise was swift and eerily similar. Diaz subtly questioned nearby passengers and cabin crew, her keen eyes scanning for any flicker of unease or deception. The air within the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension as the flight tracker displayed the dwindling time until landing, the urgency mounting with every mile closer to Heathrow. Izzy reached seat 11A and paused, feigning a need to adjust her carry-on in the overhead compartment above. This gave her a moment to observe Eleanor Vance without appearing intrusive. From this closer vantage point, the stillness was even more profound. Vance's paperback novel, a dog-eared thriller, lay open in her lap, the page bent at an unnatural angle, as if she had simply stopped reading mid-sentence and ceased. Izzy's eyes darted to Vance's hands, resting loosely on the book. No clenching, no white knuckles, no sign of a struggle against anything, internal or external, just limp repose. The waxy pallor was undeniable, a disturbing absence of life's flush. It was like looking at a meticulously crafted waxwork, disturbingly realistic yet fundamentally irrevocably wrong. She lowered her bag with exaggerated care, making a soft, clattering sound to draw attention, then turned to the passenger in the aisle seat 11B. A young man, engrossed in noise-canceling headphones and a brightly colored video game on his tablet, seemed completely oblivious to the unfolding drama. Izzy leaned closer, her voice low and conversational, projecting an air of casual neighborliness. "Excuse me," she began, pitching her tone to be just audible above the muted cabin hum. "Did you notice if Miss Vance seemed all right a few minutes ago? She looks a little unwell, and I wanted to check if she'd been feeling off." The young man startled, pulling off his headphones, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before it smoothed into polite confusion. "Huh? Miss Vance? No, I haven't really been paying attention, just been trying to finish this level." He gestured vaguely at Wet, his tablet. "She was reading, I think, when we took off. Seemed fine then?" He shrugged, then quickly replaced his headphones, his attention already drifting back to the digital world. Izzy straightened up, masking her frustration. The young man was either genuinely oblivious or expertly feigning it. Either way, he was a dead end for now. She moved to the row behind, seat 12A, occupied by a middle-aged woman with tightly permed gray hair and a meticulously organized travel bag at her feet. "Excuse me," Izzy repeated, softening her voice further, adopting a tone of concerned passenger to passenger. I'm a little worried about the lady in front of you, Miss Vance. She seems asleep but unresponsive. Did you happen to notice anything earlier?" The woman peered at Miss Vance, her brow furrowing with concern. "Oh dear, she does look rather still. No, I didn't notice anything specific, dear. Though thinking about it, she was very quiet. I thought she was just engrossed in her book. Come to think, I haven't seen her turn a page in ages." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she was perfectly fine when they served lunch. We even exchanged a polite smile when they offered the chicken or pasta. "Lunch? About 2 hours ago?" Izzy prompted gently. "Yes, roughly. Maybe a little less. 2 hours. Both, Ashton and Vance, were last seen alive and well around 2 hours ago." The time frame was chillingly consistent. Izzy thanked the woman, offering a reassuring smile that didn't reach her eyes. As she moved back towards the aisle, she subtly scanned the overhead bins above seats 11 and nothing outwardly unusual. She needed to be more thorough, but opening overhead compartments would draw unwanted attention. Returning to the rear of the plane, Izzy approached David, the seasoned steward who was still coordinating with Clara and another flight attendant near seat 32B. The atmosphere here was palpably more tense. A doctor had not materialized. Mr. Ashton remained unresponsive, his breathing shallow and erratic. Passengers in the surrounding rows were now openly staring, their hushed whispers more audible, their anxiety contagious. Izzy approached David, her movements purposeful yet calm. "Steward," she said quietly, pulling him slightly aside away from the immediate cluster of concern. "Air Marshal Diaz, can we speak discreetly for a moment?" David's eyes widened imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by professional composure. He nodded curtly, stepping a few paces away, lowering his voice. "Marshal Diaz? Of course. How can I assist?" "I believe this situation may be more complex than a simple medical emergency," Izzy stated, her voice low and direct. "I've observed another passenger exhibiting similar symptoms, several rows forward, seat 11A. Miss Eleanor Vance." David's professional facade cracked slightly, a genuine look of alarm replacing the practiced calm. "Another one? Same condition?" "Identical," Izzy confirmed. "Unresponsive, waxy pallor, no signs of struggle. It's highly improbable to be coincidental. We need to consider the possibility of something else." She deliberately avoided saying the word attack or poison, not wanting to escalate the situation prematurely. David's gaze flickered towards the passengers, then back to Izzy, his face pale. "What do you suggest, Marshal?" "Discretion is paramount," Izzy emphasized. "We cannot cause panic. For now, we need to gather information. Have you checked their belongings? Carry-ons? Seat pockets?" "We haven't touched anything," David replied quickly. "Protocol is to wait for medical personnel or authorities." "Protocol has just been redefined," Izzy countered, her tone firm but controlled. "We don't have time to wait. Landing is approaching. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we reach Heathrow." Subtly check their seat pockets. Anything unusual. Medications, food, anything that seems out of place. I'll check their carry-ons when the opportunity arises, and keep an eye on the passengers around them. Observe anyone acting strangely, anyone who seems overly interested in the situation, or conversely, anyone who is conspicuously avoiding it. David nodded, his initial shock giving way to a focused determination. "Understood, Marshal. I'll instruct Clara and the others to be discreet. We'll proceed with extreme caution." He glanced back at Mr. Ashton, then towards the front of the cabin, his expression grim. "Two, it's definitely not a coincidence." As David turned to subtly task the other flight attendants, Izzy felt a renewed surge of urgency. 2 victims were confirmed. How many more were there? And what was the method? The lack of outward signs, the dull speed of onset, the identical symptoms, it suggested something sophisticated, something insidious, something designed to be undetectable until it was too late. The mundane routine of Flight 74E had irrevocably shattered, replaced by a silent, deadly game played out in the sterile, recycled air of the cabin, 35,000 feet above the unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic. And the clock was ticking. Focusing on subtle anomalies, Diaz noticed a recurring detail. David had mentioned both victims had received drinks shortly before being discovered. Drinks served during the last beverage service, roughly coinciding with the 2-hour time frame Izzy had deduced. And now, a chilling realization clicked into place. She remembered seeing a particular flight attendant serving both sections of the cabin. A young man, relatively new-looking, but efficient and polite. She recalled seeing him near seat 32B, offering Mr. Ashton a ginger ale. And then later, she distinctly remembered him offering Ms. Vance a glass of white wine in Section A. It was the same attendant. A cold knot formed in Izzy's stomach, tighter than the seatbelt sign. Coincidence? Possible, but after everything else, astronomically improbable. She subtly gestured to David, drawing him a few steps further away from the concerned passengers. "David," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "think back to the drink service. Who served sections A and D? Specifically, around 2 hours ago?" David frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. He closed his eyes for a moment, mentally replaying the service routine. "Let me think. Clara was doing the front section, premium. I was mid-cabin. It would have been Thomas. Thomas was covering both the rear and then looped forward to assist in A and B. Yes, Thomas served both those sections." He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Izzy's, dawning comprehension slowly replacing confusion. "Why? What are you thinking?" "Both victims received drinks shortly before they became ill," Izzy stated, keeping her voice low and steady. "Served by the same flight attendant, Thomas." David's eyes widened, the color draining further from his face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Thomas? But he's just Thomas? Quiet, efficient, always follows protocol." Disbelief warred with dawning horror in his expression. "Appearances can be deceiving," Izzy replied, her gaze hardening. "We need to investigate the beverage cart he was using, discreetly. Is there a designated cart for the rear section, or do they use the same ones?" "Rear section, usually the rear galley cart. Let me check." David moved with practiced ease, weaving through the slowly stirring passengers, his movements still projecting calm professionalism. He reached the rear galley, out of sight of most passengers, and quickly glanced around. He returned to Izzy, his face grim. "The rear galley cart is there, unattended for the moment. Clara is occupied with Mr. Ashton, and Thomas is assisting further forward near Ms. Vance." "Good," Izzy said, a plan forming rapidly in her mind. "We need to examine that cart. Now, before he returns to it, can you create a diversion? Something to draw him away from the front, back to the rear of the plane?" David nodded, his mind already racing. I can page him to the rear galley for a stock check, routine procedure. He won't suspect a thing." He moved towards the galley intercom, his movements swift and purposeful. Izzy watched him, her senses on high alert, scanning the cabin, ensuring no one was paying undue attention to their hushed conversation. David spoke into the intercom, his voice calm and professional, masking the urgency beneath. "Thomas, could you please report to the rear galley for a quick stock check?" "Rear galley, please, Thomas." He clicked off the intercom and turned back to Izzy, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination. "He's been paged, should be heading back now." "Let's move," Izzy instructed, already heading towards the rear of the plane, keeping to the side aisle, moving with an air of casual purpose, as if simply stretching her legs. David followed, his movements mirroring hers. They reached the rear galley, slipping inside as discreetly as possible. The beverage cart stood in the corner, innocuous, ordinary. Stainless steel, laden with bottles and cans, ice bins, and neatly arranged napkins and straws. The very picture of in-flight service. "Check for anything unusual," Izzy murmured, her eyes scanning the cart, her mind racing, trying to anticipate where something could be hidden. David began a rapid but methodical search, opening drawers, checking compartments, his movements swift and silent. Izzy joined him, her trained eyes missing nothing. They checked the ice bins, the bottle racks, the napkin dispensers. Nothing. Frustration began to gnaw at Izzy. Had she been wrong? Was it just a terrible, improbable coincidence? Then, David paused, his fingers tracing the edge of a seemingly solid panel on the side of the cart near the base. His brow furrowed. This feels loose," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He pressed gently, and a section of the panel clicked inwards, revealing a small, concealed compartment, hidden from casual view. Inside, nestled amongst spare napkins and packets of sugar, lay a small, clear glass vial. It was stoppered with a rubber seal and contained a clear, colorless liquid. No label, no markings, just a small, innocuous vial. But in the context of everything else, it screamed danger. David carefully lifted the vial, holding it gingerly as if it were a venomous snake. This wasn't here before. This isn't standard inventory. His voice was low, filled with a mixture of shock and dread. Izzy peered at the vial, her heart pounding in her chest. Odorless, colorless, fast-acting, it fit the profile perfectly. Poison. A sophisticated, untraceable poison, designed to mimic natural causes. "Smell it," she instructed, her voice barely a whisper. David cautiously removed the stopper, bringing the vial hesitantly to his nose, sniffing delicately. He recoiled slightly, his face paling further. "Nothing, no smell, just nothing." "Odorless," Izzy confirmed, her voice grim. "Just as we suspected." The pieces were falling into place, forming a horrifying picture. Thomas, the drinks, the vial, the identical symptoms. It was no longer a theory, it was a deliberate, calculated attack. At that moment, they heard footsteps approaching the rear galley. David quickly replaced the vial in the hidden compartment and pressed the panel back into place. The click, barely audible. They straightened up, composing themselves, just as Thomas entered the galley, a slightly puzzled expression on his face. "David, you paged me for a stock check?" Thomas asked, his voice polite, professional. He glanced at Izzy, a flicker of mild curiosity in his eyes. David nodded, forcing a smile, his voice tight. "Yes, Thomas, just a routine check. Marshal Diaz was just asking about beverage service procedures." He gestured vaguely towards Izzy, trying to create a semblance of normalcy. Izzy stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Thomas, expression calm but intensely focused. "Yes, just routine protocol review," she echoed, her voice steady. "Actually, Thomas, you've been very helpful with the service today, efficient and attentive. Tell me, you served drinks to both Mr. Ashton in 32B and Ms. Vance in 11A, didn't you?" Thomas blinked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by professional politeness. "Yes, Marshal, during the last beverage service, that's correct. Ginger ale for Mr. Ashton, white wine for Ms. Vance, anything wrong?" His tone was perfectly innocent, perfectly helpful, too perfect. Izzy's gaze narrowed. "Wrong? Well, Thomas, that's what we're trying to determine. Because both Mr. Ashton and Ms. Vance have suddenly become very unwell. Very suddenly, very unwell, shortly after consuming those beverages." A subtle shift occurred in Thomas's demeanor. The polite, professional mask flickered, replaced by something colder, harder. His eyes, previously bland and unremarkable, now held a glint of something unsettling. He straightened his posture, his shoulders squaring slightly. "Unwell," he repeated, his voice losing its pleasant tone, becoming sharper, edged with a strange, unsettling intensity. "Perhaps they were deserving." The air in the galley seemed to thicken, the sterile, recycled cabin air suddenly charged with a palpable tension. Izzy stepped closer to Thomas, her training kicking into overdrive, her senses razor-sharp, every instinct screaming danger. "Deserving of what, Thomas?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous, the casual facade completely dropped. Thomas's lips curled into a thin, chilling smile. "Of justice, Marshal. Airborne justice. This flight, this metal tube hurtling through the sky, it's a microcosm, isn't it? A collection of souls suspended between worlds. And some of those souls are tainted, corrupt, deserving of cleansing." His eyes gleamed with a fanatical light, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial whisper. "I have been chosen to administer that cleansing." Just then, the subtle shift in engine pitch, the almost imperceptible change in cabin pressure announced the beginning of descent. The wheels of Flight 74E were moments away from touching down. The terrifying ordeal and the twisted logic behind it were about to reach their climax, just as they reached their destination.